Hello friends, and welcome to my Fellowship Dungeon Guide series where I go over everything you will need to know before you step into the dungeons. One thing to know about Fellowship is that as you go up in difficulty, specifically once you reach the Adept League, enemies in these dungeons will acquire a new ability, so we will be going over both the base kits as well as these expanded ability sets. But before we get started, I just ask that you consider hitting that like and subscribe button. It really helps a small channel like mine reach a wider audience. That being said though, let's take a look at the adventure Wyrmheart. The first thing I want to cover are the routing options you will have inside of Wyrmheart. Wyrmheart offers two sets of branching paths, and from the start of the dungeon, you can choose to either go left or right, where each pack offers different enemy types to encounter. The left branch has more humanoid enemies, which kind of requires more kicks and maybe a little bit more coordination. If you go to the right path, you'll encounter ice elementals, and these do more group-wide damage that's unavoidable and you can't interrupt it or anything like that. Most of the groups that I run with choose to go left, partially because there's a lot more enemies and you can kind of do bigger damage and maybe it's a little bit easier to manage. And if you go right, you'll have to pick up more enemies or more packs in the future. After you clear the first area of the map, you'll enter these ruins, and as you descend the first set of stairs, you'll encounter another branching path where you can choose to go left or right. Traveling to the right has more enemies if you need to make up for some count, and if you go left, it functions almost like a little bit of a shortcut where you can hop across these different pillars and skip a few mobs. Now let's go over the more notable trash mobs that you'll encounter inside of this dungeon. The first is the Greater Ice Elemental. This is the enemy that I was referring to that does a lot of party-wide damage that's unavoidable. These golems are really only encountered, I think, twice throughout the entire dungeon, and they have two notable mechanics. The first is Frost Stomp. This just does a large chunk of group-wide damage, and the second is a Burrowing Strike, where the golem will disappear and a target reticle will appear underneath a player, and all party members need to stand inside of this circle to distribute the damage, otherwise it's likely gonna one-shot whoever it's targeting. The next mob of note are the Arcane Scholars, and realistically these are probably the most dangerous mobs that you'll encounter inside of this adventure. These are caster mobs where their primary cast is called Arcane Strike. It just does a little bit of damage towards the tank. It's interruptible, but you can kind of let these go for the most part. However, the most notable ability that these scholars have is called Rune of Detonation. You'll see this giant pattern appear under them as they channel this cast. It pulses damage the longer it goes on for, so you want to try to kick this immediately. You can also crowd control the enemies, so if you don't have any kicks available, you can always opt to use your CC ability. Once you do reach Adept, however, these scholars gain a new ability, which is, they're these like ice orbs. They will target the farthest player away from them, where a little ice shard spawns and it'll slowly drift towards whichever player it initially spawned underneath. As these orbs travel, they will pulse damage. It doesn't really do a ton. If you come in contact with the orb, however, it will explode and deal a massive amount of party-wide damage. So it's definitely something that you want to be aware of. And to make it more manageable, it's easier if 3 of the party members stack up in melee, and then you just have one party member standing at a range, so that they can kind of control all of these orbs themselves. Moving along, the next mob we have are the Eldrin Chronomancers. These mobs have a primary cast, or channel rather, called Decrepify. I believe it targets the tank typically, and it'll do a chunk of damage over time. And I think it also might reduce the armor of the tank, so if the tank is getting trucked, you probably want to kick this. If not, you can probably let this channel go on for the most part. Once you reach Adept, the priority kick for these mobs becomes a cast or channel called Temporal Manipulation. It increases the haste for all mobs around the Chronomancer. So realistically, if the Chronomancer is the last mob that you're dealing with, you don't have to worry about kicking it. However, if you're doing a big pull, and there's going to be lots of mobs, you want to make sure that they're not all getting hasted. So you really need to be on the lookout for this new ability that, again, will only be encountered in Adept Leagues or higher. You will also encounter mobs called the Blades of Sithril. These are melee mobs that deal physical damage, and they have 3 notable mechanics that you need to be aware of, especially if you're playing in melee. These might be your worst nightmare. The first ability is called Slicing Blades. This is a channeled ability where the mobs will begin spinning, chasing after their primary target while just doing this blade storm. So it's going to hit in an area around them, and if you're in melee, you just really need to be aware of this. So just stay on the lookout. It's what makes this mob such a pain for melee players. This channel can't be interrupted with kicks, but you can, again, crowd control them to stop them from spinning and making it a lot easier to deal with. The second ability of these mobs is called Icebreaker. These mobs will target a single player with a circle around the player, and they will leap to that player shortly after, dealing area of effect damage and knocking that player in the air. This ability does a pretty sizable chunk of damage, so if you're low, make sure that you are popping defensives whenever you're getting targeted. And the final thing to note is that these mobs enrage at 30% health. You can see this by them having this red glow or outline around their physical models, and this will just increase their damage dealt. The final notable mob are the Cold Heart Assassins. These enemies really only have one mechanic. Throughout the fight, they will briefly disappear, and then they will reappear and start channeling an ability called Wicked Strikes. Wicked Strikes will target a non-tank player. It'll stun them in place for as long as the channel is going on, and it'll deal continuous damage for the duration of the channel. You can kick this ability. You can also interrupt it with crowd control abilities, and you definitely should, because if it goes on a healer, especially a healer, then your group might be in trouble. The channel lasts, I think, 4 seconds, and you just, really need to be aware of this because it does a pretty good amount of damage, and just not being able to heal anything because your healer is stunned is not ideal. And finally, let's move into the boss of this area, Apostate Varus. Varus is primarily a caster boss with a few abilities that can be interrupted. The most notable and important ability to kick in this fight is called Frigid Mist. This is a channeled ability where the longer it channels, more ice puddles will spawn under players, and these puddles of ice do a lot of damage while also slowing the players. One puddle is created immediately upon the cast going off, so you're guaranteed to get at least one puddle, and then every second or so another puddle will continue to spawn, so you need to kick this almost immediately. And I think it's best to assign the kick for this to a ranged DPS, because you should almost always be able to kick in this case, and this way you can also avoid melee maybe getting stuck outside of their kick range, and the ranged DPS can always cover that scenario. The remaining kicks need to be used on a cast called Icy Death. This will target the primary target, so typically it's going to be casted at the tank unless something went catastrophically wrong, and this ability does a large amount of damage. It's not going to one-shot the tank by any means, but it will do some chunky damage, and if you let too many of them get through, then your tank is going to start dipping low, and the healer is going to have to overcompensate, which means that they're going to have less mana for a longer drawn-out fight. The next ability I want to talk about is called Howling Blast. This is a conal attack that targets the tank. It covers a massive area. It will one-shot basically any non-tank player. So what the tank needs to do is position yourself so that the boss is always pointing this cone towards the outside of the room. The actual cast of Howling Blast doesn't follow the tank once it's begun channeling. So what this means is once you see that giant cone being placed, the tank is safe to move out of it so that you avoid all that unnecessary damage. Glacial Spikes is an ability that summons 6 set of circles under every player's feet. These are going to spawn these little ice spikes that do a good chunk of damage, and they also knock the players up with how this combines with Frigid Mist, it can be a little difficult to dodge sometimes, so just be aware. If you're playing in melee, I think it's best to kind of group up with your tank and walk together so that way you're not cutting each other off unnecessarily. Once you reach Adept and onward, Varus gains a new ability called Splintering Ice. This will target a random player with a red pattern under their feet, and this pattern will have different arrows pointing out and away from them. Once this debuff expires, or if the healer dispels it, ice shards will be expelled from the player in the directions that the arrows are pointing. If players are hit by these ice shards, it does a pretty good chunk of damage, so you will have to be aware of this. And if you're a healer, you don't want to dispel this immediately. You want to give players time to kind of react to them having the circle so they can plant their feet and then let other players kind of dodge around them so that everyone is able to simply avoid these ice shards. So all that means is just give players, you know, maybe like 2 or 3 seconds to just position and just be aware of these ice shards coming shortly. And that's gonna wrap up this guide of Wyrmheart. Let me know in the comments if you feel like I missed anything. But this was GooberTroy. Thanks for watching, and I hope you all have a terrific day.